In the tapestry of human experience, there are stories that transcend the ordinary circumstances that bring them to light, tales so profound in their simplicity and so powerful in their truth that they transform everyone who hears them. Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom has been the stage for countless such moments, but none quite like the one that unfolded on a crisp autumn morning when an elderly couple shuffled through the doors carrying not just a parking violation, but a love story that had endured for over 6 decades through trials that would have broken lesser souls. Harold and Dorothy Whitman were 83 and 81 years old respectively, their bodies bent by time but their spirits intertwined in a way that spoke of a partnership forged in an era when marriage vows were considered sacred contracts rather than temporary arrangements. They moved slowly as they entered the courthouse, Harold's weathered hand firmly clasped around Dorothy's smaller one, their steps synchronized in the careful rhythm of people who had learned to navigate life's challenges together, one measured pace at a time. The parking ticket that had brought them to Judge Caprio's courtroom seemed almost insignificant in the context of everything they had survived together. The Great Depression's final years, World War II and its aftermath, the birth and raising of 4 children, the building of careers and the establishment of a home that had served as an anchor for their extended family for over half a century. But for Harold and Dorothy Whitman, this simple citation represented something much more complex. Another challenge in what had become an increasingly difficult struggle to maintain their independence and dignity in the face of advancing age and diminishing resources. Judge Caprio, settling into his chair that morning, had no way of knowing that he was about to encounter 2 defendants whose story would challenge every assumption he thought he had about justice, compassion, and the true meaning of partnership. The courtroom was filled with the usual mix of people dealing with municipal violations, some resigned, some defiant, most simply hoping to resolve their issues quickly and move on with their lives. But Harold and Dorothy Whitman stood apart from the rest, not because of their advanced age, but because of something ineffable in their bearing that suggested they carried within them stories worth telling, wisdom worth hearing, and lessons worth learning. What had brought the Whitmans to court that morning was a parking violation that, on its surface, seemed straightforward. They had parked in a handicapped space without displaying the proper permit. The fine was $65, a sum that might seem modest to many people but represented a significant expense for a couple living on a fixed Social Security income that hadn't kept pace with the rising costs of medication, utilities, and the basic necessities of life. But the story behind that parking violation was far more complex and heartbreaking than anyone in the courtroom could have imagined. Dorothy Whitman suffered from advanced Parkinson's disease, a progressive neurological condition that had been slowly robbing her of her mobility, her independence, and her ability to perform the simple tasks that most people take for granted. The disease had crept into their lives gradually over the past 8 years, first manifesting as a slight tremor in her left hand that they had initially attributed to normal aging, then progressing through stages of increasing difficulty with walking, balance, and fine motor control that had transformed their golden years from a time of peaceful retirement into a daily battle against an implacable enemy. Harold had become his wife's primary caregiver, a role he had assumed not out of obligation but out of the same love that had sustained their marriage through 6 decades of joys and sorrows, triumphs and setbacks, moments of profound happiness and periods of genuine hardship. At 83, with his own collection of aches and ailments that came with advanced age, Harold had reorganized his entire life around Dorothy's needs, learning to help her dress when her fingers could no longer manage buttons, preparing meals when her hands shook too much to hold utensils safely, and providing the constant emotional support she needed as she faced the progressive loss of her physical capabilities. The parking incident had occurred during one of Dorothy's increasingly frequent medical appointments, visits to specialists that had become a regular part of their weekly routine as her condition continued to deteriorate. The Rhode Island hospital parking garage had been full that morning, and after circling for 20 minutes looking for a legal space, Harold had made the difficult decision to park in a handicapped spot near the medical building entrance. He knew they qualified for a handicapped parking permit. Dorothy's neurologist had told them so months earlier, but the process of obtaining the proper paperwork had proven more complicated than they had anticipated. The bureaucratic maze required to get a handicapped parking permit had overwhelmed Harold, who had been dealing with an increasing number of similar challenges as Dorothy's condition worsened. Forms needed to be filled out by multiple doctors, submitted to different government offices, and processed through a system that seemed designed for people who had unlimited time and energy to navigate its complexities. For an 83-year-old man who was already stretched to his limits caring for his ailing wife while managing their household, their finances, and their medical appointments, the permit application had remained one item too many on an already overwhelming to-do list. On the morning of the parking violation, Harold had helped Dorothy out of their aging sedan and into her wheelchair, a process that required considerable time and effort as her Parkinson's made even simple movements difficult and unpredictable. By the time he had gotten her safely into the medical building and to her appointment with a neurologist, he had been gone from the car for over 2 hours, far longer than the time limit posted for the handicapped space, and long enough for a parking enforcement officer to issue a citation. When Harold returned to find the bright orange ticket under his windshield wiper, he felt a crushing sense of defeat that went far beyond the financial burden of the fine. It was another reminder of how difficult their lives had become. Another example of how systems that should help elderly and disabled people often seem designed to make their lives more complicated instead of easier. But Harold Whitman was not a man to give up easily. The same determination that had carried him through a marriage spanning 6 decades and a lifetime of challenges would now carry him into Judge Caprio's courtroom to tell their story and accept whatever consequences awaited them. As they sat in the courthouse waiting area that morning, Dorothy's hand trembling slightly in Harold's steady grip, neither of them realized that their story was about to touch the heart of a judge known for his compassion, or that their decades of love and survival were about to inspire everyone who heard their tale. They had come to court simply to be honest about their situation and to face whatever penalty their violation had earned them. They had no idea that their quiet dignity and enduring love were about to provide Judge Frank Caprio with one of the most profound reminders he had ever received about what really matters in life. The love story of Harold and Dorothy Whitman began in 1961 at a church social in Providence's Federal Hill neighborhood, where 21-year-old Harold first laid eyes on 19-year-old Dorothy as she served coffee and homemade cookies to the young adults who gathered every Friday evening for fellowship and community. Harold, recently returned from his military service and working at a local manufacturing plant, was immediately struck not by Dorothy's beauty alone, though she was indeed beautiful, but by the gentle kindness with which she treated everyone she met, from the popular young men to the shy wallflowers who often stood alone at such gatherings. Their courtship was conducted with the proper decorum expected in that era: supervised visits in Dorothy's family parlor, chaperoned walks through Roger Williams Park, and carefully planned group outings that allowed them to get to know each other while maintaining the respectability their families demanded. Harold was drawn to Dorothy's quick wit and generous spirit, while she appreciated his steady reliability and the way he listened to her opinions with genuine interest rather than the patronizing attention many young men of the era showed toward women's thoughts and ideas. They married on a brilliant June day in 1962, exchanging vows in the same church where they had met, surrounded by families and friends who could see that this was not merely a convenient match but a genuine union of two souls who complemented each other perfectly. Their wedding photos, which Dorothy still kept in a leather album that had grown soft with age and countless viewings, showed a young couple glowing with happiness and hope, their faces bright with dreams of the future they would build together. The early years of their marriage were marked by the typical struggles and joys of young couples starting out in life. Harold worked long hours at the manufacturing plant to support them, while Dorothy kept their small apartment spotless and began building the network of friendships and community connections that would sustain them throughout their lives. When their first child, Margaret, was born in 1964, followed by Robert in 1966, Susan in 1969, and finally Thomas in 1972, their home became the center of a bustling family life that filled their modest house with laughter, arguments, homework sessions, and the constant activity that comes with raising 4 children. Harold proved to be not just a provider but a hands-on father who helped with homework, coached Little League, and never missed a school play or graduation ceremony. Dorothy managed their household with the efficiency of a military commander and the warmth of someone who genuinely loved creating a home where everyone felt safe and valued. Together, they navigated the challenges that test every marriage: financial pressures when Harold was laid off during a recession in the late 1970s, health scares when Dorothy needed surgery to remove her appendix, and the normal tensions that arise when two strong-willed people share a life and make decisions together. Their partnership deepened through these challenges rather than being weakened by them. Harold learned to recognize the signs when Dorothy was feeling overwhelmed and needed support, while Dorothy developed an intuitive understanding of Harold's moods and concerns that allowed her to provide comfort and encouragement exactly when he needed it most. They established patterns of communication and mutual support that would serve them well in the decades to come, learning to talk through problems rather than argue about them, to share burdens rather than carry them alone, and to celebrate each other's strengths while compensating for each other's weaknesses. As their children grew up and eventually moved away to establish families of their own, Harold and Dorothy entered what should have been the golden years of their marriage, a time when they could travel, pursue hobbies they had deferred during their child-rearing years, and simply enjoy each other's company without the daily pressures of work and family responsibilities. Harold had retired from the manufacturing plant after 35 years of faithful service, and Dorothy had left her part-time job at a local library where she had worked once their youngest child started school. For a few beautiful years, they did exactly what they had dreamed of doing. They took bus tours to national parks, visited their children and grandchildren, tended a garden that became the envy of their neighborhood, and settled into a comfortable routine of shared meals, evening walks, and quiet contentment that felt like a reward for all their years of hard work and mutual devotion. Harold learned to cook so he could surprise Dorothy with special meals, while Dorothy took up watercolor painting and created beautiful landscapes that decorated the walls of their home. But in 2015, when Dorothy was 73, the first signs of Parkinson's disease began to appear. It started subtly, a slight tremor in her left hand that she initially dismissed as a sign of normal aging, occasional difficulty with balance that they attributed to the inner ear problems that often affect older adults, and a general slowing of her movements that seemed consistent with the natural effects of advancing years. For months, both Harold and Dorothy convinced themselves that these were simply the normal changes that come with growing older, nothing that couldn't be managed with a little extra care and attention. The diagnosis, when it finally came after months of tests and consultations with specialists, hit them like a physical blow. Parkinson's disease is a progressive neurological condition that gradually destroys the brain cells responsible for producing dopamine, leading to increasingly severe problems with movement, balance, and eventually cognitive function. There is no cure, only treatments that can slow the progression and manage symptoms for a while before the disease inevitably wins its cruel victory. Harold's first instinct was to research everything he could about Parkinson's disease, filling their dining room table with printouts from medical websites, books borrowed from the library, and pamphlets from support groups. He approached Dorothy's diagnosis with the same methodical determination he had brought to every challenge in their marriage, convinced that knowledge and planning could help them manage whatever lay ahead. Dorothy, characteristically, focused on the practical implications, what modifications they would need to make to their home, how long she would be able to continue with her painting, whether they should consider moving to a retirement community where medical care would be more readily available. What neither of them fully understood at the time was how profoundly Parkinson's disease would transform not just Dorothy's life, but their entire relationship and daily existence. As Dorothy's symptoms progressed over the following years, Harold gradually took on responsibilities that had always been hers: meal planning and preparation, household management, coordination of medical appointments, and eventually the intimate personal care tasks that Dorothy could no longer perform independently. The role reversal was difficult for both of them, challenging decades of established patterns and forcing them to redefine their partnership in ways they had never anticipated. Harold and Dorothy Whitman, the court clerk announced, and the elderly couple rose slowly from their seats in the back of the courtroom. Harold immediately moved to Dorothy's side, offering his arm for support as she struggled to stand, her movements made difficult by the Parkinson's tremors that had become more pronounced with the stress of being in an unfamiliar environment. Together, they made their way toward Judge Caprio's bench, their progress slow but dignified, Harold matching his pace to Dorothy's careful steps and whispering quiet encouragements that only she could hear. Judge Caprio looked up from his paperwork as they approached, immediately struck by something he had seen countless times in his courtroom but never failed to find moving: the unmistakable bond between two people who had weathered life's storms together. There was something in the way Harold positioned himself protectively near Dorothy, in the way she leaned slightly into his strength, that spoke of a partnership that transcended the simple legal matter that had brought them before his bench. "Good morning," Judge Caprio said warmly, his voice automatically gentling as he addressed the elderly couple. "Please, take your time. There's no rush here." He had noticed Dorothy's trembling hands and unsteady gait, and his decades of experience had taught him that elderly defendants often felt intimidated by the formal courtroom setting, needing extra time and patience to feel comfortable enough to tell their stories. "Thank you, Your Honor," Harold replied, his voice carrying the slight quaver that comes with advanced age but still retaining the clear diction of someone accustomed to speaking respectfully to authority figures. "We're here about a parking violation. I parked in a handicapped space without the proper permit, and I want to take full responsibility for that." Judge Caprio nodded, appreciating Harold's straightforward approach, but something in the man's demeanor suggested there was more to this story than a simple parking violation. "Can you tell me what happened that day, Mr. Whitman?" Harold glanced at Dorothy, who nodded encouragingly despite the tremor that made her head shake slightly. Well, Your Honor, my wife Dorothy has Parkinson's disease, and we were at Rhode Island Hospital for one of her appointments with the neurologist. The parking garage was completely full, and I drove around for about 20 minutes looking for a space. Dorothy was getting very tired and stressed from being in the car so long, and her symptoms get worse when she's anxious. The judge leaned forward slightly, his attention fully focused on Harold's explanation. Around the courtroom, other defendants and spectators had grown quiet, sensing that they were witnessing something more significant than a routine traffic citation hearing. I knew I shouldn't park in that handicapped space without a permit, Harold continued, his voice steady but filled with the weight of difficult decisions. But Dorothy needed to get to her appointment, and I was afraid that if we kept driving around looking for a space, she might have one of her episodes. So I made the decision to park there, thinking I would just have to accept whatever consequences came from it. Judge Caprio's expression had shifted from professional interest to genuine concern. Mr. Whitman, if your wife qualifies for a handicapped parking permit, why don't you have one? This question opened the floodgates to a story that neither Harold nor Dorothy had intended to share in detail, but which poured out of Harold with the relief of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden alone for too long. We've been trying to get one for months, Your Honor, but the paperwork it's been difficult for us to navigate. Dorothy's condition has gotten worse over the past year, and I've been learning to take care of her while also trying to manage all our other responsibilities. Harold's voice grew quieter, more strained. I used to be good at handling paperwork and dealing with bureaucracy, but I'm 83 years old, and sometimes I get confused by all the forms and requirements. The handicapped permit application requires signatures from multiple doctors, has to be submitted to different offices, and they kept sending it back because I was missing some piece of documentation or hadn't filled out some section correctly. Dorothy, who had been listening quietly, reached out and placed her trembling hand on Harold's arm in a gesture of support. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear, despite the slight slur that Parkinson's had introduced to her speech. Harold has been taking such good care of me, Your Honor. He helps me get dressed in the morning, makes all my meals, drives me to all my appointments. He shouldn't have to spend hours on the phone with government offices trying to get paperwork straightened out when he's already doing so much. Judge Caprio felt his throat tighten with emotion as he listened to this elderly couple's story. In his years on the bench, he had heard countless tales of hardship and struggle, but there was something particularly poignant about witnessing two people in their 80s dealing with the cruel realities of aging while maintaining such obvious love and support for each other. How long have you two been married? The judge asked, though he suspected from their easy intimacy and shared strength that the answer would be measured in decades rather than years. 61 years this past June, Harold replied, and a small smile crossed his weathered face. We met at a church social when she was 19 and I was 21. I knew the first time I saw her that she was the one I wanted to spend my life with. Dorothy's eyes, despite the fatigue and stress of their current circumstances, sparkled with memory. He was so shy at first. It took him 3 months to work up the courage to ask me to go for a walk with him after church. The moment of lightness in their testimony made their current struggles seem even more heartbreaking. Judge Caprio could see that beneath the medical challenges and bureaucratic frustrations, Harold and Dorothy Whitman were still the young couple who had fallen in love over 60 years ago, still supporting each other through whatever life brought their way. Mrs. Whitman, the judge said gently, can you tell me how the Parkinson's has affected your daily life? Dorothy took a shaky breath before answering. It's hard, Your Honor. Some days are better than others, but I need help with almost everything now. Buttoning my clothes, cutting my food, even writing my name. Harold does all of it, and he never complains, but I know how tired he gets. He's not as young as he used to be either, but he acts like taking care of me is the most natural thing in the world. Harold's eyes filled with tears at his wife's words. She took care of me and our 4 children for decades, Your Honor. She made our house a home, supported my career, and was the strongest person I knew. Now it's my turn to take care of her, and I consider it a privilege, not a burden. The only thing that breaks my heart is that I can't take away her pain or make her symptoms go away. The courtroom had grown completely silent as everyone present absorbed the profound love and devotion they were witnessing. Judge Caprio, known for his emotional responses to touching cases, was visibly moved by this display of enduring love in the face of devastating illness. Judge Caprio sat in stunned silence for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of what Harold and Dorothy Whitman had just shared with his courtroom. In 3 decades of presiding over municipal court, he had encountered every conceivable human situation, heard every possible explanation for rule-breaking, and witnessed both the best and worst of human nature. But nothing had prepared him for the profound impact of witnessing such pure, enduring love in the face of such devastating circumstances. The judge removed his glasses and wiped his eyes, no longer concerned with maintaining judicial composure in the face of such raw humanity. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion and filled with a respect that transcended the formal boundaries of his courtroom. Mr. and Mrs. Whitman, in all my years as a judge, I have never heard testimony that has moved me more deeply than what you have just shared. Harold and Dorothy stood quietly before the bench, Harold's arm protectively around his wife's shoulders as she leaned into his strength. They had come to court prepared to accept whatever penalty their parking violation had earned them, never expecting to find themselves the recipients of such profound understanding and compassion from the legal system they had approached with such trepidation. Judge Caprio stood up from his bench, a gesture that immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the courtroom. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the weight of moral authority and deep personal conviction. What I see before me today is not a parking violation. What I see is a love story that has endured for over 60 years, a partnership that has weathered every storm life could throw at it, and 2 people who continue to exemplify the very best of human devotion and commitment. The judge's words seemed to resonate through the courtroom, touching everyone present with their power and sincerity. Court officers who had heard thousands of cases found themselves wiping away tears, while other defendants waiting their turns sat in respectful silence, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Mr. Whitman, Judge Caprio continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, when you made the decision to park in that handicapped space, you weren't breaking the law out of convenience or selfishness. You were making a choice that any loving husband would make. You put your wife's well-being above your own concerns about potential consequences. That's not criminal behavior, that's heroic behavior. Harold's weathered face crumpled with emotion as he heard his agonizing decision described not as a failure but as an act of love. 4 months, he had been carrying guilt about that parking violation, adding it to the mountain of worries and responsibilities that had become his daily burden. To hear Judge Caprio reframe his actions in terms of devotion rather than rule-breaking was like having a weight lifted from his shoulders. But the judge was far from finished with his unprecedented response to their case. Mrs. Whitman, I want you to know that you have one of the most extraordinary husbands I have ever encountered. For him to have taken on the role of your primary caregiver at his age, to have reorganized his entire life around your needs, to have faced the bureaucratic maze of our healthcare system while managing your daily care, that level of devotion and strength is remarkable. Dorothy's trembling hand found Harold's, and she squeezed it as tightly as her condition would allow. Through her tears, she managed to whisper, "He's always been my hero, Your Honor. Every single day for 61 years." Judge Caprio felt his own voice breaking as he heard these words of profound love and gratitude. He turned to address his court clerk with instructions that would surprise everyone present. I want you to call the Department of Motor Vehicles right now and find out exactly what paperwork Mrs. Whitman needs for her handicapped parking permit. Then I want you to call their office and tell them that I personally want to expedite this application. The unusual request caused a stir in the courtroom, but Judge Caprio wasn't done with his extraordinary response to the Whitman situation. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out his personal business card, writing something on the back before handing it to Harold. "Mr. Whitman, this is my personal phone number. If you have any more problems with bureaucracy, any difficulties getting the services you and your wife need, I want you to call me directly." Harold looked at the card in amazement, hardly able to believe that a judge would offer such personal assistance to defendants in his courtroom. "Your Honor, we can't ask you to do that. You must be so busy, and we're just—" Judge Caprio interrupted him with a gentle but firm voice. "You're not just anything, Mr. Whitman. You and your wife represent everything that is good and noble about human commitment. You've shown me what real love looks like when it's tested by the cruelest circumstances life can devise. Helping you isn't just something I can do, it's something I need to do." The judge then did something that shocked everyone in the courtroom, including his longtime staff. He came out from behind his bench and approached Harold and Dorothy, extending his hands to both of them in a gesture of respect and solidarity. "I am honored to have met you both," he said simply. "Your love story has reminded me why I became a judge in the first place, not to punish people for their mistakes, but to recognize the humanity in every person who comes before me." As Judge Caprio took Dorothy's trembling hands in his steady ones, he spoke directly to her with the tenderness of a grandfather speaking to a beloved family member. "Mrs. Whitman, I want you to know that your husband's love for you shines so brightly that it has illuminated this entire courtroom. You are blessed to have found such a partner in life, and he is blessed to have found someone worthy of such devotion." Harold could no longer contain his emotions and began to cry openly, the stress and worry of months of struggling alone with Dorothy's care finally finding release in the face of such unexpected understanding and support. Judge Caprio placed a comforting hand on the older man's shoulder and said something that would be remembered by everyone present for years to come. "Mr. Whitman, let me tell you something that I want everyone in this courtroom to hear. Love is not just an emotion, it's an action. And for 61 years, you and your wife have demonstrated what love in action looks like. Today, instead of punishing you for a parking violation, I want to honor you for showing all of us what real commitment means." The judge returned to his bench with a determination that surprised even his experienced staff. "Not only am I dismissing this parking citation completely, but I'm going to do something I've never done before in this courtroom. I'm going to arrange for a city van to provide transportation for you and Mrs. Whitman to all of her medical appointments, so you never have to worry about parking again." The unprecedented nature of Judge Caprio's response left the courtroom in stunned silence. Here was a judge who had looked beyond the letter of the law to see the spirit of love that had motivated a technical violation, and who had responded not with punishment but with admiration and practical assistance that would make their difficult lives a little easier. Harold and Dorothy stood before the bench, overwhelmed by the kindness and understanding they were receiving, hardly able to believe that what had started as a dreaded court appearance had become one of the most affirming experiences of their long lives together. The transformation that began in Judge Caprio's courtroom that autumn morning rippled far beyond the legal resolution of a simple parking violation, creating waves of change that would touch Harold and Dorothy Whitman's lives in ways they never could have imagined. As news of their extraordinary court appearance spread through Providence and eventually across the country, their story became something much larger than a tale of bureaucratic compassion. It became a beacon of hope for countless other elderly couples facing similar struggles, and a reminder to everyone who heard it of what true love looks like when it endures through life's greatest challenges. Within hours of their court appearance, Judge Caprio's office received the first of what would become hundreds of calls from people who had been moved by the Whitman story. Local news stations picked up the tale, and soon Harold and Dorothy found themselves at the center of a groundswell of community support that overwhelmed them with its generosity and kindness. But more than the practical assistance that began flowing their way, they were touched by the emotional response from strangers who saw in their partnership a reflection of the kind of love they hoped to find or maintain in their own lives. The promised city transportation service materialized within a week, but it came with an unexpected enhancement. The Providence Department of Senior Services, inspired by Judge Caprio's advocacy and the public response to the Whitman story, implemented a comprehensive transportation program for elderly residents dealing with medical challenges. Harold and Dorothy became not just beneficiaries but inadvertent founders of a service that would help hundreds of other seniors maintain their independence and access the healthcare they needed. More immediately, the bureaucratic obstacles that had prevented them from obtaining Dorothy's handicapped parking permit vanished overnight. Judge Caprio's personal intervention had expedited the process, but the publicity surrounding their case prompted a broader examination of why such permits were so difficult for elderly residents to obtain. The DMV streamlined their application process, created a fast-track system for seniors with progressive medical conditions, and established a help desk specifically designed to assist elderly applicants who struggled with complex paperwork. But the most profound changes were those that occurred within the Whitman family itself. Their 4 adult children, who had been trying to provide support from various distances while managing their own careers and families, were inspired by the attention their parents received to reorganize their own priorities. Margaret, their eldest daughter, took early retirement to move back to Providence and help with Dorothy's daily care. Robert arranged to work remotely from Rhode Island for several days each week, while Susan and Thomas began taking turns spending weekends with their parents to give Harold respites from his caregiving duties. The family support system that emerged from their court appearance created a sustainable network of care that allowed Harold to continue being Dorothy's primary caregiver while no longer carrying the entire burden alone. For the first time in years, Harold was able to get full nights of sleep, knowing that one of his children was there to help if Dorothy needed assistance. The respite allowed him to regain some of his own strength and health, which had been declining under the stress of round-the-clock caregiving. 6 months after their court appearance, Harold and Dorothy returned to Judge Caprio's chambers for a visit that had nothing to do with legal proceedings and everything to do with expressing gratitude for the profound impact his compassion had on their lives. The change in both of them was immediately apparent. Harold looked rested and more robust, while Dorothy, though still battling the progression of her Parkinson's disease, seemed more at peace and surrounded by visible evidence of being well cared for and deeply loved. "Judge Caprio," Harold said, his voice stronger than it had been during their first meeting, "Dorothy and I wanted to come back and thank you not just for what you did for us that day, but for reminding us that there are still people in the world who see beyond rules to the human beings affected by them." He paused, searching for words adequate to express his gratitude. "You didn't just dismiss a parking ticket, you restored our faith that we weren't alone in facing these challenges." Dorothy, whose speech had become more labored but whose spirit remained strong, added her own thanks. "You helped us remember that our love story doesn't end because I got sick. If anything, it becomes more beautiful because Harold has shown me every day what commitment really means." Her trembling hand found Harold's with the automatic gesture of someone who had been reaching for the same person for over 6 decades. "And now our children have learned from watching him what real love looks like." Judge Caprio, visibly moved by seeing them again and witnessing the positive changes in their lives, reflected on how their story had affected him as well. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitman, you may think I helped you, but the truth is that you helped me remember why I chose to work in the justice system. You showed me that sometimes the most important justice isn't about applying laws, but about recognizing the love that motivates people's actions." The judge had begun incorporating the Whitman's story into his speaking engagements at legal conferences and community events, using their example to illustrate how the justice system could be both firm in upholding necessary rules and flexible in recognizing the human circumstances that sometimes made rule-breaking not just understandable but admirable. Their case had become his go-to example of how compassionate justice could transform lives rather than simply processing violations. As Dorothy's Parkinson's continued to progress over the following months, the support network that had emerged from their court appearance proved invaluable. The city transportation service ensured they never missed medical appointments, while the streamlined permit process had provided them with all the documentation they needed to park legally wherever Dorothy's care required. But more than the practical assistance, they were sustained by the knowledge that their love story had inspired others and that their struggles had helped create resources that would benefit other elderly couples facing similar challenges. Harold's caregiving responsibilities continued to be demanding, but they were no longer overwhelming. With his children sharing the load and community resources providing practical support, he was able to focus on what mattered most, ensuring that Dorothy felt loved, valued, and cared for every single day. He had learned to see his role not as a burden imposed by her illness, but as the natural extension of the vows he had made 61 years earlier to love her in sickness and in health. Their story had become legendary in Providence, cited by social workers, healthcare providers, and advocates for the elderly as an example of how love could triumph over even the most difficult circumstances when supported by community compassion and appropriate resources. But for Harold and Dorothy themselves, the greatest victory was simply waking up each morning knowing that they were facing whatever the day might bring together, surrounded by family and community support, and secure in the knowledge that their love had not only endured but had inspired others to believe in the possibility of such devotion. 2 years after their court appearance, when Dorothy's condition had advanced to the point where she required more intensive medical care, Harold was still by her side every day, still holding her hand, still whispering the same words of love he had spoken for over 6 decades. Their children, inspired by their father's example, had learned to see caregiving not as a sacrifice but as a privilege, the natural expression of family love when it's tested by life's greatest challenges. The parking ticket that had brought Harold and Dorothy Whitman to Judge Caprio's courtroom had seemed like just another problem in an already difficult situation. But it had become the catalyst for a story that reminded everyone who heard it that true love isn't just about the easy moments of youth and health, but about the choice to keep loving when loving becomes the hardest thing you'll ever do. Their 61-year marriage had become a testament to the power of commitment, the beauty of partnership, and the truth that some love stories don't end. They just become more profound with each passing day, each shared challenge, each moment when one person chooses to care for another with a devotion that makes life worth living.